Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Tariq Masood. I'm an associate professor of public policy here at the Carnegie School, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. So many of you have probably been paying attention to events happening in Egypt over the past 2 years, ever since the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak in January 2011. And when you were watching the dramatic events of January 2011, you were probably riveted by a particular set of very photogenic, Western-looking political activists, right? These are people like Wael Ghunaim, the Google executive who was the admin of a particular Facebook page that was an important organizing center for protests, and all these other very photogenic people. And you remember President Obama at the time when he was asked, you know, behind closed doors, what do you want to see? He said, I want to see the kids win, and I want to see the Google guy become president. Right? That was what we thought this revolution was going to produce. And yet now, 2 years later, when we look at the face of Egypt, it is not those young, photogenic, Western-oriented people, but it is a man named Mohammed Morsi, who is a dour representative of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he is now Egypt's president. And so understanding what this change means and where this Muslim Brotherhood leadership will take Egypt and where their leadership of Egypt will take the movement is what our speaker today will cover. We are thrilled to have with us probably the finest scholar of Egyptian politics and law in this country, Professor Ellis Goldberg.
Somebody behind me?
Who is a professor of political science at the University of Washington. He's written very widely on issues of law and politics in Egypt in the 20th century in particular. He is the recipient of numerous grants and awards, including the prestigious Carnegie Scholarship, and this year he is actually a Guggenheim Scholar as well. So we are thrilled to have Professor Goldberg here, and we'll look forward to a very vigorous discussion. Thank you.
Well,
so join me in welcoming him.
Okay, well, thank you. I wanted to thank Tariq and the Kuwait Foundation and Harvard for inviting me. The last time I was in this particular location, I believe it was still the MTA yards, and Cronin's, a bar, was right down the street. It was a very different Harvard that I attended as an undergraduate, but it's always fun to be back to the places of your former crimes. And what I wanted to begin with was something that Egyptian friends of mine have been saying pretty frequently for the last couple of years, which is, does anybody actually understand what's going on? And sometimes my belief is that anyone who tells you they do really understand what's going on doesn't actually get what's going on. Because things seem to be changing so rapidly that as soon as we think we have a handle on what's happening, something completely different comes along and throws us off. But as the Egyptian, and I'm just thinking out loud here, I'm going to say today, I want to share with you some of my thoughts about what's going on and see if we can come to some kind of a sense of where things might go. As the Egyptian transition moves imperceptibly toward the writing of a constitution, and into the consolidation of a new regime, it's really a moment to stop and look backwards and forwards. Hosni Mubarak and the political elite that surrounded him has been swept away. Some of the old elite has left the country, others are in jail, and the rest are lying low. But as we try and figure out what's going to happen, we also notice that many of the questions that seem to have been burning a year ago or 6 months ago have now receded. For example, why did the monarchies survive? Nobody's really that interested in that question except perhaps the King of Jordan, who wonders if it poses a false question today. Now, what I'm going to suggest, therefore, to you is a kind of speculative approach to the Egyptian revolution. I offer it up in the spirit in which I offered up Mubarakism without Mubarak, which I wrote just as the Egyptian armed forces had occupied downtown Cairo in late 2011. It's a way to think about things, but I'm not putting it forward as the decisive approach to what the future will hold. As Yogi Berra put it, predicting is hard, especially about the future. And most of my colleagues in political science, I think, properly restrict themselves to retrodiction, which is a much more secure form of testing your analysis. For those who are interested, I do have a blog called Nisra Nasser, the Eagle or Vulture of Victory, which must be flying one way or another. So what we're looking at now, just at this very moment in Egypt, I think, is the familiar but poorly understood intersection in the life of popular uprisings that bring down regimes. The moment when a new compact is written and when new institutions are put into place. And what all of us, ordinary Egyptians, academics, US policymakers, want to know is what happens when an elite committed to dramatic institutional change gains control of the government. And our understanding of these events is, I believe, fairly poor in theory, because these events lie at the intersection of two very different and sometimes contradictory, but equally intellectually compelling accounts of revolutionary change, social movements, and the accession of new elites to power. Now, our understanding of Egypt is especially poor because I think for the most part we've been asking the wrong questions, but even when we've asked the right questions, it's mainly been as a form of taxonomy and classification rather than analysis. We're more interested in whether the Egyptians have made a real revolution, or are the Muslim Brothers a social movement, or what types of hybridity characterize the regimes in the Arab world, rather than what seem to be the mechanisms at play and what are the possible outcomes that we might expect. Mohammed Morsi, until recently a leader of the Muslim Brothers, and then the founding president of its political wing, the Freedom and Justice Party, became over the summer the country's first freely elected civilian president. The Muslim Brothers now occupies what I suppose Lenin would have called the commanding heights, at least of the Egyptian political system. And as in 1952, we're observing a profound transformation of Egyptian political institutions and structures of political power that will affect domestic and regional politics for generations to come. And in fact, I think we can say in the last couple of days, we can see the emergence of a challenge and a possible train wreck that will certainly affect the region and the Egyptian government, as well as Gaza and the Israelis. What I want to suggest here, and I'll draw this out for a bit, is that the dominant party in Egypt today, the Freedom and Justice Muslim Brothers Party, will increasingly be the party of government rather than a religious movement. And it will be pragmatic and prudent, which many of my colleagues think is a good thing, but it will also enact conservative and frequently repressive politics. If Egyptians are lucky, what this will all end up looking like is the Mexican party of the institutional revolution. If they're not so lucky, it will look like an Egyptian party of Islamism in one country. It is not likely to be a country that will go to war, but neither will it be a country able to advance peace, and it will not be Singapore or Korea, but neither will it be a failed state. Two common accounts of what happens in the situation that we're looking at is that the movement gives up its radical goals and becomes pragmatic on achieving power. And another approach is that it commands or deforms the political system in order to accomplish unrealistic goals. But there's another view that I think more accurately describes what we'll see. The movement itself is absorbed into the machinery of the state, but it remains committed to its goals by adding new institutional structures. For those who like science fiction, you can imagine perhaps the Borg as the Egyptian state absorbing the Muslim Brothers. Rather than what I'm going to suggest later is the common analytic perspective the other way around, that the Muslim Brothers will somehow command the state as if it was a transparent instrument of control. Now, one view of revolution is that there is rapid and complete political, social, and economic change achieved through strategically necessary and possibly the massive use of violence. And that approach, I think, was actually developed here at Harvard by Professor Moore and Professor Scotchpole over many years, and I think it's a very compelling view. A related view is that revolutions do not so much transform as reinforce whatever patterns of centralization and bureaucracy already existed. And this, of course, is due to a French scholar by the name of Tocqueville, who, among other things, spent a couple of years in the United States investigating prisons, a great way, evidently, to have gotten a grant in the early 19th century, and then write a book on a completely different subject, which has remained a classic to our day. The claim that real progress toward democracy is more likely to occur when there are no challenges to a regime requiring the use of violence is a different outcome, but based on the same analysis, that the use of violence is what tells us about revolutionary regimes. There's another view of revolution, which sees it as the creation of any new set of institutions that eliminate the power not only of an elite, but indeed of the relationships on which their power was based, while much else remains undisturbed. And some of us may remember this from Marx's understanding of India, that British colonialism was a form of revolution. One of the most provocative implications of this vision is that we might wish to reverse Marx's notion of colonial rule as a form of revolution, and instead see revolution as a form of colonial rule by a distinct, if internal, elite. And here we can actually see Marx and Edmund Burke joining hands to give us a more dystopic view of revolution, which is why, and ultimately it's not clear to me what we want to accomplish by arguing about whether the Egyptians had a real revolution or not. I'm sure Edmund Burke would say they didn't, and thank God for that. Our understanding of social movements is similarly contradictory. Sometimes social movements are seen as disruptive attempts by the poor and the excluded to gain recognition, to make claims on government expenditures, and to achieve political influence, if not power. But sometimes they're seen as structured institutional processes whose leaders articulate goals and in the process draw groups into political activity who were hitherto inchoate and unformed. Now, the events that I discuss have occurred in Egypt adds piquancy, perhaps, to our notion, because we get the notion of social change associated with images of a pharaoh. Let's see, and this has become, okay, I'm not quite sure how I get next here. I've probably frozen the screen somehow.
No, I'll do the tech support. Just do that.
Okay, there we go. So, pharaohs are bone-chillingly deadly, and of course when they come back to life, it's a real problem, at least in American movies. Sometimes it's a matter of also of archaeologists who open tombs, but for Egyptians, Pharaoh's curse means something else entirely, I think. It's the way in which a leader who promises liberation turns out in the end to be yet another authoritarian. And this, I think, is the likeliest trajectory for Egypt under Mohamed Morsi and the party that he was involved in founding. The fault, I will argue, lies less in the Tana leaves that are so important in the movies about pharaonic regeneration, and more about the institutions, the institutional structure of the government, which has remained intact. But the problem with that is that, of course, includes the courts as well as the executive authority, so it's a very mixed bag. Now, three currents, as far as I can tell, have dominated academic and non-academic commentary on the role of the Muslim Brothers. I'll just briefly rehearse them. One is that the Muslim Brothers are a disciplined movement which slowly but surely is making the transition to totalitarian control of the Egyptian state and society. And the state is the instrument through which the movement will dominate society and turn it to its ends. The second is that the Muslim Brothers are a misunderstood movement who are being transformed through the relationship to power, from radicalism to moderation, as they come to terms with the responsibilities of governance. And the third is that the Muslim Brothers were even more understood, were always essentially a moderate movement, at least since their refounding in the 1980s, and decided for their own reasons to abandon direct confrontation with the government and have now committed themselves to democratic norms and institutions. And if they were only allowed to show their true colors through the accession to power, we would see a very, very different institutional and organizational structure. I want to propose a fourth possibility. There are lots more possibilities, but I'm just going to propose one fourth one, which is that the Muslim Brothers will, over the next several years, be transformed from a heterogeneous movement to a state party dominated not by its present civil leadership, but by its elected officials. That is, I'm arguing it's going to look a lot more like the Labor Party institutionally, but also like the Soviet Communist Party. The government will dominate the party and use it for its own ends. This has elements of similarity to those other analyses, but is different insofar as it recognizes that the Muslim Brothers as a party will themselves become subordinate to the state, and that the leaders of the Freedom and Justice Party will displace the leaders of the Muslim Brothers and restructure the movement. And at the end of my talk, I'm going to go through some very specific things that have happened that I think indicate the tensions or the strains, at least in that direction. Now, as I say, there are some predictions that are associated with each of these analytic outlooks. The first current sees a coherent and disciplined movement, all of whose members have granted personal allegiance to the general guide, the head of the Muslim Brothers, and his deputies, and will carry out orders that they are given. At bottom, this is a vision of the Muslim Brothers, which has many affinities to the communist parties and the Nazi movement. And that's where the analysis is drawn from. Now, the MB are indeed a highly disciplined organization within the context of Egyptian politics, but we probably shouldn't overstate what this means, especially now. Ordinary members who form the bulk of the organization sign membership cards and pay dues. There's a second tier where members do swear an oath of obedience to the general guide, demonstrate knowledge of the organization's principles, and attend meetings. And then there's a highest level of active members who may be 800,000, who are clearly what we would think of as cadre. Nevertheless, the reality is that the Muslim Brothers has been a heterogeneous movement in some ways, in which the members will often have different political orientations, and as long as they carry out the tasks that they're given, are allowed fairly wide latitude in terms of what their particular views of politics should be. Now, the danger of the confusion of a line dividing the Muslim Brothers as a movement from being a political party has already occurred to the leadership, which is why I think they created the FJP, the Freedom and Justice Party, as a separate party from the Muslim Brothers. They could have turned the Muslim Brothers into a party itself. That was legally an option. But what they've also done is force all members of the Muslim Brothers to join the FJP and only the FJP. So they blurred, on the one hand, they've recognized that distinction. On the other hand, they've blurred it in some ways. And they've made it easier to gain the votes of non-activists, but they've also forced members now to accept a single particular political party as their locus of affiliation. Now, in the last 20 months, the maintenance of the level of discipline that the Muslim Brothers are said to have, and that I'm sure the leadership would like to have, has proven to be difficult, and nowhere more so than among the highest cadres of the movement. Okay, and I'll talk about that now. As the Muslim Brothers has entered the political arena with the FJP, it's clear that the top leaders, when confronted with the stark choice between pursuing their own political ambitions and their own political paths, on the one hand, or submitting to organizational discipline, have largely chosen not to submit. The outstanding example is obviously Abdulmenem Abdel Fattah, who was forced out of the Muslim Brothers because he wanted to run for president when the organization still claimed that it was not going to run a candidate. This is a more complicated story. I'm not going to get into it now. But what we can certainly say is Abdulmenem decided that he was not going to be bound by the discipline of the party at that point. Others who have left voluntarily or with some pushing include Ibrahim Zafarani, described by Munir Habashi as one of the architects of the MB's electoral strategy, and Mohammed Habib. In 2011, the MB expelled Mohammed al-Qasas and Ahmed Abdul Gawad when they formed a Tailor al-Misri, another party that contested elections. And this leads me to two conclusions. The first is that the leadership may well have become more coherent over the last couple of years. But the other conclusion is that it is still made up of people who have sufficient political ambition and sufficient strong wills not to place organizational loyalty first. So there may be other conflicts that are emerging. The MB has not split, but this has not been because it has been able to maintain the kind of discipline over the leadership that we are assured that it has. There's another set of problems, by the way, with this, which is that the underlying analysis, I think, misunderstands the difference between the Muslim Brothers today and either the communist or the Nazi movements in the past. It's true that Lenin and Hitler ran the governments their movements seized, and it's also true that they ran those countries through the apparatus of the government, not so much through the apparatus of the party. Moreover, two other characteristics distinguish then from now. In each case, Lenin and Hitler were the founders of their movement and had significant personal charisma and the allegiance of members. This is clearly not the case of the Muslim Brothers, whose charismatic founder was murdered in 1949, and whose present general guide is the 7th or the 8th in what is now a routinized set of charisma. The other thing to think, though, about Hitler, Lenin, and even, by the way, Ayatollah Khomeini, is that each of these people ultimately created a constitutional structure in which their role was placed within the government. They didn't rely on the party within an otherwise existing frame of government. They ensured that they themselves were inserted into the governing structure. So what I'm suggesting is that part of the story we will see. And I think if we look at the Constitution that is now being drafted, we can see elements of that. So lastly, I want to point out one other thing. It's about the Ikhwan themselves. The present general guide, Mohammed Badir, was chosen in an election when the former general guide, Mahdi Akif, quit or resigned in order to allow democracy to flourish within the organization. And there's no reason for Mohammed Morsi, Khairat Shater, or Issam al-Irian not to think that they could have been the general guide just as well as Badir. So all of these people who are supposed to have personal allegiance to the general guide must also be thinking somewhere in their heart of hearts, you know, I could have been that guy. He's not really any better than I am. And one lesson that I did learn when I was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship is that I had no idea how many colleagues I had who realized that it was inexplicable why I got one and they didn't. So that seems to be a more general characteristic of human beings. Now, as I've said, the second analytic current is one that sees the Ikhwan as a group that is already a force for political moderation or is likely to become one. And this more or less is in contradiction then with that first notion. And here we simply have to say the problem is that movements can come to power and actually implement the policies that they said they were going to implement. That Lenin actually nationalized all of the capital, ultimately all of the capital structure in the country, land, physical capital, and the rest. The Nazis actually did carry out programs of anti-Semitic import, as well as making war on Europe in order to create what they thought was necessary living space. And other politicians, generally on assuming office, do tend to carry out whatever their goals are, whether they're moderate or extreme. And I think, well, I think it's true. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that the Ikhwan are like either the communists or the Nazis in terms of their program. But I do think they do have some programmatic preferences, and I think we can see that. It's also the case that quite possibly within the spectrum of Egyptian opinion today, the Muslim Brothers are more or less moderate. That is, they lie somewhere in the middle between extreme Salafis and socialist secularists. Between my friends in The Revolution Will Continue and my other friends in the Salafi group. But that doesn't actually tell us very much about whether they're willing to accept a liberal constitution. And just as one example, their current leaders have explicitly said that while they think the Egyptian constitution should not prevent a Christian from becoming president, they themselves would never vote for one under any circumstances whatsoever. So that doesn't strike me as the hallmark of a liberal party, although it's certainly better than writing a constitution that formally forbids some people from becoming the president. The Muslim Brothers, by the way, we were talking about this last night, they've carried out some of their other promises, for example, to create a specific role for the Azhar in the legislative process. They've redefined the principles of Sharia in the Constitution so that it's more inclusive. It now includes a bunch of more specific legal possible argumentation, the so-called adilla and ahkam, which means that basically those people who want to challenge legislation in the courts now have a much wider variety of sources from Islamic law to bring to bear. So in that particular sense, they have certainly carried out their promises, which many of my colleagues thought they wouldn't. And in fact, actually, Tariq al-Bishri, that was the other point that he made in that article, which was that he's afraid that the Ikhwan have gone down the path of creating the state of the faqih instead of the state of the jurist, that is the constitutional qadi. And since Tariq al-Bishri is an outstanding leader of the Islamist, at least intellectually, of the Islamist current, and has certainly played an important role in shaping a part of the political process, although I think he's given more blame than he deserves, this is a remarkable kind of criticism, I think, of what they're doing. Now, it's also the case that the Muslim Brothers have paid a tremendous amount of attention to constitutional writing. And given that this is an organization that once had the slogan, "The Quran is our constitution," it is notable that it didn't occur to anyone, actually Muslim Brothers, Salafi, or anybody else, when the first meeting of the Constitutional Committee was formed to say, well, we don't need a constitution, we've already got a document. I mean, if the Quran is our constitution, then you just have a maswada that's the Quran, right? And obviously, nobody actually seriously thinks that. So I'm saying, so the slogan, "The Quran is our constitution," is misleading, and those people who cite it as somehow what the Ikhwan are up to misunderstand that they do have some very, very specific understandings of what they want political institutions to look like. And I think what they want those political institutions to look like are ones that will favor their remaining in power. I'm going to run out of time in a little bit, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, and we can talk about this in questions. I don't think, however, that accession to political power has made the Muslim Brothers very much more moderate. If anything, it's given them now the chance to create a political system that they think will be favorable to their long-term goals. But I do want to address one other question, which is the idea that Morsi is a subordinate leader, that Morsi somehow has to do what Badi' and Khairat Shatar tell him to do. And this, of course, arises from the widely shared perception, and correctly so, that the Muslim Brothers wanted to nominate Khairat Shatar for the president. He was supposed to be the president, and Morsi was the stand-in. And those who read Arabic especially probably remember all of the jokes about the tire murdering the president. There were these tire, and there'd be a tire iron or an ice pick stabbed into the tire. And it was, "I killed the president," i.e., he's a spare tire. And if you puncture the spare tire, then that gets rid of the president. And a lot of people thought this was hilarious. And I thought it was kind of hilarious. But it's a way of, I think, of misunderstanding, or as George W. Bush would have put it, who you remember was not supposed to be president because his older brother Jeb was actually supposed to be president, of misunderestimating people like Mohamed Morsi. And there's always people that we misunderestimate. Stalin was one. Lyndon Johnson was one. I'm just trying to think of who were some of the others. Khrushchev was one. And the guy who we misunderestimate always then turns out to have goals of his own. And Sadat was one. And having survived under such a potent leader turns out to require certain kinds of skills and vision that don't appear until later. So I don't think that Morsi is such a spare tire. In fact, he has shown himself to be quite skilled, but he has inherited the institutional apparatus of the Egyptian state, created under Nasser and Sadat, and refined and reinforced by Mubarak. And he himself is now a part of that state. Now, his unexpected great accomplishment was to, actually, I just realized I was going to show you some other pictures, but Morsi's great accomplishment, this is the mummy waking up. Sorry, we have some different mummy pictures. Oh, why don't you go to the next one? This is actually how Egyptians tend to look at mummies. They wake up and they become politically active. You see, the mummy is shouting, "I'm free." This was by art students in Zamalek. For those who know that area, there's an art school in the middle of downtown Zamalek. don't you go to the next one? Oh, okay. So, and here's this is our notion of revolution. It happens in about 30 seconds. Somebody lifts up the flag. Some people are killed, and the Bastille comes down, and it's all over. And you forget about what happens between roughly September 1789 and January 1800, the messy period. So, okay. So Morsi's great accomplishment was to order the generals who headed the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which basically took power in February 2011, to resign. And Morsi and his supporters have presented this as his great and heroic moment. We know relatively little about the bargaining that preceded it, but the draft constitution strongly suggests that basically these guys struck a deal. And the deal was the army generals got to keep control of the army, and they got to be separated from the rest of the state. The question is, did Morsi do this on his own, or did he require help from Badia and from Chaucer? And the answer seems to be that he claims he got no help from Badia, who he has said was off praying. And he's quite dismissive about Badia's role. Badia was praying, and you couldn't reach him, and so he had nothing to do with this. And Chaucer may have had something to do with it, but nobody's ever said. Now, we do know that the army general who became the head of the armed forces, Abdel Fattah Sisi, although was not himself a member of the Brotherhood, was a cousin of Abbas al-Sisi, who was a founding member of the Muslim Brothers. So the notion that Sisi and Morsi could have come to an accord without Chaucer and Badia is certainly quite possible. That is to say, Abdel Fattah Sisi was not someone who had a reason to fear the Muslim Brothers. He had every reason to believe that they were people with whom you could work something out. Badia has not played a very conspicuous or noticeable role. I could spend some time talking about that, but basically, in fact, he recently made the Hajj, and I think there was quite a bit of criticism of him for showing up during part of the Hajj where he was surrounded by a group of young men who were his bodyguards. But it's also not quite clear why, when the conflict over the Constitution was hitting a high point, he was outside the country. Now, it could be that he so strongly controls the Muslim Brothers and Mohammed Morsi that he could afford to go away for, I don't know, a week or a week and a half while this conflict was playing out. But if so, he would be the first such leader, I think, in history to have left his post in such a period. More interesting is the role of Khairat Chaucer, who we are told is the real leader. Badia is just the beard, not really the leader. Khairat Chaucer is actually the leader. And this is pretty interesting because we do know that Chaucer has a very, very important role in that he's been given by Morsi. I don't know, does anybody here know what his role is? Any Egyptian specialist in Egypt? Okay, so just for suspense, I have to say that. His role is, his official role in the new government is that he has been given the portfolio of creating a free trade zone in Rafah, on the border with Gaza, in the present circumstances. And he made one trip to northern Sinai where he talked to various Bedouin leaders. And other than that, his job is to transform the economy of Rafah, both in Egypt and in Gaza, to create a new free trade, capital economy. And I would say that if I was Mohammed Morsi and I wanted to get rid of a rival, giving him the portfolio of having to deal with Hamas, Gaza, the Israelis, the tunnel economy, the corruption, and all the rest, 250 miles away from Cairo, the only better one I could imagine would be to send him to deal with one of the problems, perhaps in the oases, or perhaps somewhere along the Sudanese border, which is even further away. But I don't see this as, I see this as one of those jobs that you give to political rivals that they can't refuse, and yet that almost certainly set them up either for failure or not doing anything. Okay? I might be wrong about that, but that's how I would read it. Now, what we also know recently is, and this is total rumor, okay? Total rumor, but it's a rumor that's really hard to completely discount. There are accounts that at a recent meeting of the Shura Council of the Muslim Brothers, the Shura Council has demanded that Morsi dismiss the government of Hisham Kandil and replace it presumably with a government headed by Khairat Chaucer. And we're certainly assured that this will happen after the elections. Now, the problem with the news about Kandil's government is that it comes from a paper that I don't trust very much called El Misrayun. So we don't trust it. It's kind of like the Fox News of Egypt. But on the other hand, the problem is it's kind of like a report on Fox News about the Tea Party. Nobody else is going to have better information about it than Fox News. So this very detailed account of this meeting, it's hard to know if this is a trial balloon, if it's nonsense, if somebody made it up, or if indeed it actually reflects something that's going on inside. But it is the case, as far as I can tell, that nobody has denied it. Now, there's one other thing that's happening along these same lines, which is, you remember that I mentioned we have this party called the FJP. And when Morsi was the founder, he resigned, or the founding president, he resigned his position in the FJP because as president of all the Egyptians, he couldn't be the head of a party. So then there had to be an election to determine who would be the head of the party. And the natural assumption was that the vice president, who was also the kind of charge d'affaires of the party once Morsi had resigned, Issam el-Erian, a very, very prominent politician, would step into his place. But it turns out that Saad al-Qahtani, the former Speaker of the House and the leader of the Muslim Brothers parliamentary delegation in the past, decided that he also wanted to run for president. And when it came time to present nominating petitions, Erian presented 109 and admitted that he would not be able to get one from Morsi. And Saad Qahtani presented more than 400. And guess who won the election? Saad al-Qahtani. So we now have, this is almost like the Labour Party in 1919, right? We now have a political party founded by the Muslim Brothers, which is led by its former parliamentary delegation, which suggests also to me the degree to which this party is going to become an instrument for the political leaders of the state. Lastly, I'm going to conclude by saying it's quite remarkable also the way in which Morsi is now being perceived in the. So this is one perception of Morsi in October magazine is this, and this is the Muslim Brothers periodicals are even going way further over the top than this. It turns out that Morsi is pretty much. Again, part of this makes perfect sense in one way, but the way it's expressed is pretty much over the top. Basically, God is on Morsi's side, because it's impossible to imagine how Morsi could have accomplished all of this without God's help. And I mean, in some sense, that's a perfectly banal comment to make. I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, that God helps all of us do anything that we do. But there's also a sense that somehow he now has a special role in society and Egyptian politics and history. And people are also beginning to make fun of this. For those who read Arabic, you'll see that it's from Amr bin Abdulaziz to Mohammed bin Morsi. And here Morsi is presented not as the horseback rider in kind of quasi-English attire, but as one of the khulafa, at least as presented on television, I think. I mean, he's a television Khalif.
Is this meant to be ironic? Or
I think it's from October magazine. I think it's meant to be ironic. I can't. Unfortunately, there's no little comment in the news story that it. But I think that's what I think they're getting at. This is how he sees himself, and his interest in going to mosque, showing up at a different mosque every Friday with a different a security guard, is kind of interesting. And then in the street, these are my summer vacation photos. Well, actually, my winter vacation photos. There's a whole different notion that actually goes against the Muslim Brothers' approach to things, and this is this notion of this would be a different talk on martyrs and how people conceptualize martyrs. There's a bunch of non-standard notions now of martyrdom that have surfaced in Egyptian life, and this is Imad Afet, the Azhari sheikh who was killed, who here has wings and I think a little kind of a halo. It's a little ambiguous whether he's actually got a halo, but he clearly has wings. And the iconography here is pretty interesting from my point of view. Now, where do we stand? Okay, now I'm going to stop. I'm just going to take one last comment. We're actually at a very interesting crossroads. There are two things that I'm just going to point out. One of them is what's happening today in Gaza. all of a sudden, Mohamed Morsi is now going to have to confront the desire of lots of Egyptians that Egypt do something about Israel's military action in Gaza. And I'm sure that his generals, both the ones he kicked out and the ones he retained, are going to explain to him that he has no military option. And I'm sure the foreign ministry is going to explain to him that he doesn't have much of another option because we've got to get the IMF loans or we've got to get the loans from the European Union. And, people aren't going to be so happy about the notion. And besides, somebody else will explain to him, the Israelis would actually like nothing more than for Egypt to reoccupy Gaza. So if we were to send in troops, ultimately we're going to be stuck the same way that the U.S. was stuck in Iraq. We're not going to be able to get them out, right? So what this means is Morsi is, and there's already quite, I think, an emerging criticism on the left. I'm sure that parts of his base are also unhappy with why hasn't he carried out his plans to be more confrontational. And the problem here, I don't actually care about that. My concern is something else. What's his view of the Muslim Brothers and the FJP going to be? As president, whatever decisions he takes, he's going to need the cadres of the FJP, and especially the Muslim Brothers, to go out and explain to people why whatever it is that he did was right. So they are now going to be caught up in the decisions of the government, whether they like it or not. Some of them will, some of them won't. But this is that same kind of process that I'm talking about, not about the brotherhoodization of the state, but about the statization of the brotherhood. And there's one last kind of thing which will be quite interesting, which is whether Morsi decides to show up at the actual installation ceremonies for the new Coptic Pope. Because he can either go to church, or he can not go to church. He can go to the ceremonies that are not in church, or he can not go to them. And Salafi leaders have made it clear they don't think he should go to any. Muslim brother, the Muhammad al-Barr, has said he can go to the ceremonies, but not to the religious ceremonies. And he's going to have to make some decisions about that, and those will also be revealing, because that will tell us something about how he conceives himself as the president of Egypt. But it will also be a way in which ultimately, again, he has to force his base to go along with whatever he's decided to do. So the temptations of power are there. They are real. Morsi is enmeshed now in the presidential system in Egypt. And what I would argue is that this is the most important single element of the transformation going forward. Thank you. Oh, these are soccer fans.
That was really tremendous. Thank you. We have about 25 minutes for questions. And so I'm going to abuse my
and you'll like this
position.
See who they are?
Yeah, they're all MB.
Yeah.
So I'm going to abuse my position and ask the first question, which is, so I see the forces that you're identifying that would be pushing the Muslim Brotherhood into this, into this role and the statization that's happening to the Muslim Brotherhood. But are there any countervailing pressures? So, and particularly from the bottom up, do we think that? How do we think that the Egyptian people are reacting to the things that they're seeing the Muslim Brotherhood do? And might the Egyptian people punish the Muslim Brotherhood at the polls for behaving in too imperialistic and heavy-handed a manner in this period in which they've been governing?
I almost feel like I should say it's people who study the Muslim Brothers, not innocent people like me who studied the Egyptian working class, who ought to be answering that question. But my guess is, but I won't do that. I've only done it in a backhanded way. So what I think though is that there's a tendency to want to find an alternative, but the problem is what actually is the viable alternative in Egypt today, and at the moment the viable alternative to the Ikhwan, as we've seen, is the Salafi movements. Then has been Noor and the others. At what point that changes, and at what point political leaders, like Hamdin Sabahi, to what extent Abdel Fattah would be. I don't think he's going to be pushed outside the role of loyal opposition. So I think he's going to be quite careful about where he goes because of his own particular fears. But the problem is it's hard to tell exactly who do you punish them with. What the election results over the last couple of years have shown is that as long as large numbers, I think, of Egyptian Muslims don't feel that religion itself is existentially at stake, which was how the March 19 referendum was framed for a lot of people. There's clearly significant antagonism to the Ikhwan. But the problem is, where does it go, and to what extent can it yield a winning coalition? And at this point, that just doesn't seem politically very, very viable. But as I think most of you know, Morsi only won the presidency with about 51% of the vote, and that was a very reduced vote. The last thing is that there is clearly a very strong, and you and I have talked about this, there's a very strong urban-rural divide in Egypt today. So clearly within more urban areas, there's a much greater willingness to challenge the Muslim Brothers, much greater opposition to them, and in rural areas, much greater interest in the Muslim Brothers and the Salafis. And of course, the boundary between the Salafi parties and the Muslim Brothers is also a very porous one.
All right, I think we should open it up for questions, please.
Yeah, I have a question. In this authoritarian trajectory you sketch, with the state having absorbed the Ikhwan, that in turn has morphed into a dominant party, where does the deep state come in? Is it reconstituting itself? Has it reconstituted itself? How much of it is still intact?
Okay, so the question is about the deep state. This raises a different set of issues. Since I'm quite friendly with, Ashraf Sharif, I'm not sure if you've been reading Ashraf Sharif stuff or others. The idea was that just as in Turkey, there's a set of claims about Turkey that the military had a state apparatus underneath the state that was able to carry out its own goals apart from the state. I've always been a little uncertain about that. The problem with studying the military, it's a little bit like studying corruption. It's very difficult to get good information about things that people really want to keep hidden because they're doing something that's wrong and illegal. I've been a little skeptical about the deep state, not because I don't think that the Egyptian army and military intelligence and the other general security agencies don't exist as independent bodies, but it's less clear to me how easily they can coordinate their activities in the present as opposed to in the period from the 50s through the 70s. So is there a deep state? I don't know. If there is a deep state, Morsi's claim is that he brushed it aside with great ease. I think there was a deal, but I don't think the army really wants to run I've always been skeptical about the notion that the army wants to run Egyptian society. I think the army wants to run the army and wants the society, like all armies, like our own army, wants society to provide whatever resources generals think they need. And then generals want to tell civilians when they think they can do certain things and when they don't think they can. So I'm a little skeptical in that sense. I've also been very skeptical about the notion that there's a large military economy. I see the military economy as being between 3 and 8% of the Egyptian economy. The inflated claims that I've seen that it's between 20 and 40% make me wonder what role the Suez Canal. Where's the Suez Canal in that economy? Where's all of the arable land of Egypt in that economy? Where's Egypt's oil and gas production in that economy? The army, though, does play a role in production, especially production for its own goods and the sale of excess goods. But it also plays a very crucial role in the tourist economy. And what I think most people don't understand, and actually we learned this in the Egyptian business history research project that I was involved in the 1980s, what Sadat and Roger was there. You remember this stuff. Basically, in order to jumpstart capitalism, Fuad Sultan and other ministers realized that there was all this land that the state or the army owned, and it was not being used for anything. And that it was in places that you could build luxury hotels, but Egypt was in no position to build luxury hotels, so they came up with the idea that we'll lease this land at concessionary rates to Hilton and, I don't know, whatever the other big hotel companies are. And they'll build hotels and we'll provide infrastructure and that'll provide jobs and recreate a tourist economy. And the Army thought this was a great idea. And the Army has also pursued it with vigor. Anybody who's seen Army, I don't know if anybody goes to Egypt, and there's an Army Officers Club in Zamalek, which used to be really forbidding. And it's still kind of forbidding. But it turns out now that if you want to have a party, a wedding party, you can rent it. Who knew? If you want to go bowling, they have a bowling alley. Who knew? So there has been a way in which the Army has begun to monetize many of its possessions. And I think people are very aware of this. And this has led to the sense that somehow the Army is a pervasive economic as well as political actor. And I don't think the Army actually really wants to be that pervasive political actor. They would just as soon have the Muslim Brothers take the brunt of people's anger about, for example, what's happening in Gaza. I'm sure that at this moment, I don't feel sure about very much. Who knows what's going on? But I do feel that at this moment, if we could talk to Field Marshal Tantawi, he would say, I'm just as happy that Mohammed Morsi is the one who's going to face popular wrath about what to do about the Israeli incursion into Gaza. And I'm just as happy that it's not me. And I'm sure Abdel Fattah Sisi is saying, all I can do is give the president advice. But it's up to him to make the decision. So I'm dubious about the deep state, not because I don't think the security apparatuses have a lot to do and play an important role, but I'm dubious that they're the ones who actually make those kinds of decisions.
Yes, sir.
When the current government was being when the current government was being formed, two of the ministries that the Brotherhood insisted on were higher education and youth. What, in your view, are the implications of this insistence? What might be its implication for possible nationalization of education in Egypt, for review of the qualification of professors and teachers, for curriculum?
Okay, that's a very good question. I may be overly simple-minded. I've always assumed that the Muslim Brothers wanted health and education because those are the main sources of patronage. So while I think they may want to vet who is a professor, they're more interested in ensuring that there are jobs for Muslim Brothers who have doctorates and or other degrees and who can enter the teaching profession. That would be my particular take on those things. And the Muslim Brothers do have a very strong, again, the Muslim Brothers were refounded in the 80s in a sense. And I think most people who I've read, who've written about them, Hussam Tamam and others, I think, Nabil Abdel Fattah, I think as well, make the point that when they were refounded in a sense after the debacle of the 60s, they have a much stronger student presence, a much stronger urban presence, and now a much stronger presence among professionals who also have university degrees. So in that particular sense, I think they are very interested both in the ministries that employ those people, that regulate what those people do. And I don't think it's so much a question of controlling as seeing that as their actual base. And again, one thing that I was very concerned about in the draft constitution, I seem to be one of, actually, again, Tariq al-Bishri was one of the other people who found this disturbing. Many people haven't, surprisingly to me. Under the new constitution, or the draft of the new constitution, to be elected to the upper house of the legislature, you have to have a university degree. And to my knowledge, this is the first time ever in Egypt that the constitution, the 1923 constitution had a property qualification for election. But this is the first time there's ever been an educational qualification. And it's the first time, as far as I can tell, that there's kind of a step backward in the sense that there's a, if you would, here it's an intellectual capital qualification instead of a physical capital qualification. So I think that's more in tune with, that's how I would tend to see it. Yeah, Roger.
Just on that last point, I mean, the electoral law is different from the Constitution.
Right.
And historically, so you could have all kinds of property qualifications and educational, as there were in the 1920s, as we know. Just the elephant in the room seems to me the economic situation, which you didn't mention, and the fact that there's tremendous pressure to create jobs versus the IMF's prescriptions, and that seems to me there will have to be a fight within the Muslim Brothers and those people who try and influence opinion between whether you want a large growth of the state to create jobs, which is the easiest way to do it quickly, and the slimline state demanded by the IMF and so on.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. But so in terms of what I've been thinking of, the crucial thing is whatever it is that Morsi decides to go ahead with, he's going to have to bring some group of Muslim brothers who are going to be unhappy with that decision. Clearly, there are within the Ikhwan are not an anti-capitalist party. They're not a party that's opposed to people making money. They're not they have several multi-millionaires. I don't think there are no billionaires, I think, in the... I'm not sure, but I think the billionaires form a different club. But there are lots of multi-millionaires. So there are clearly people who would like to see the IMF, the Mubarak and the IMF neoliberal agenda pursued, and there are other ordinary members who I think find it unacceptable. There's going to be a conflict there, but what's remarkable about the Ikhwan is the way they've avoided conflicts becoming actual organizational splits. Having said that, I'm actually myself not very, what should I say, not very hopeful about the Egyptian economy over the short run, because it seems to me that the things that would be most useful for inserting Egypt into the global economy and creating jobs are precisely what there's a tremendous amount of antagonism to do. And just to give you one example, there's the Pharaoh el-Baz's notion of creating a second Nile seems nonsensical to me. But there's been a lot of government support for that. On the other hand, the notion of actually doing, oddly enough, I think it was Kitchener who did, using the Egyptian government to, for example, rebuild the rail lines, rebuild the roads, and build refrigerated warehouses all across Lower and Upper Egypt in order to allow Egypt to export more fruits and vegetables to Europe, which I think would be a great idea, provide immediate employment, provide access to a market. Seems one that everybody in Egypt that I know thinks is pretty much a bad idea. I do, however, I will just on the economic front say that I find it amazing that Egypt exports less to Europe in terms of value than not just Israel, but than Tunisia. So Tunisia, a country of 8 to 10 million people, it exports more fruits and vegetables in value than Egypt does. And somebody will always tell me, what about potatoes? Egypt exports potatoes to England. I think you mentioned this, I think, once upon a time. Every February. And it's been exporting those potatoes since the beginning of the 20th century. But the problem is that potatoes are not a high-value product. And it's clearly, there's kind of a mismatch here in terms of what you would think of as both the absolute, not to mention the relative value of Egyptian products. And clearly, there's not, at this point, there's no strategy designed to actually take account of that. And when I've talked to people about the Egyptian government, about why it doesn't do this, I'm actually told that even within the government itself, there's just not, the trade representatives just don't pursue it. It's not the Europeans are refusing, they're too pure for Egyptian produce, and only the Israeli and the Tunisian, the Moroccan produce is good enough. It's that there's just not much is going on. Yeah.
Can you comment on what has happened? Can you comment on what has happened to the court system since the departure of Awad al-Mur?
I can't comment very much on since the departure of Awad al-Mur. I can comment on the last couple of years. Would that work? Okay. So the court, actually, in fact, I went to a couple of very interesting meetings that were called by and attended by several Supreme Court justices early in 2011, when they were already pretty disturbed about the likely course of events. And I think there are two things. One thing is that the courts. This is one of the most remarkable, I guess I would say this is one of the most remarkable aspects about the events in Egypt over the last couple of years, which is that actually the structure of the governance system has remained largely intact, and that includes the rule of law. So if you're a fan of revolution in its cataclysmic Marxist Leninist sense, there's no revolution has happened in Egypt. If you're one of those people who wanted the tumbrils to be brought into Maidan Tahrir, the enemies of the revolution to be executed, and revolutionary tribunals to have been established, that didn't happen. I think that's actually a good thing. But there are some people, I'm sure, for whom that's a regrettable outcome. But when we hear people say there was no revolution or there should have been a revolution, remember, that's really what they're talking about, unless they have some notion of the revolution is the bad guys just say, yes, we lost. We'll be leaving now, and please take over, which has never happened. So I think the thing about the courts is the courts have played an important role as increasingly as the defenders, not just of liberalism, but of a certain sense of individual rights. On the other hand, in the early days, the courts also stepped in at various moments in ways that I think were a mistake, because the courts substituted themselves for political action at moments when the political leaders themselves couldn't figure out what to do. One example one example is important, one example may seem silly. The one example that's important is the dissolution both of the NDP and the dissolution of the local assemblies, where the court said, okay, it's over, these are illegitimate. The problem is that should have been a decision taken by the political leadership, not by the courts. And the courts were stepping in to basically clean up a mess that had been left. The sillier one, but which I think is also important, is when the courts decided that the name Mubarak should be stricken from a large number of public areas, the metro and that was also shows the same problem in a different way. That should have really been left to local bodies to decide. And the reason it should have been left from my point of view is that should have been a moment at which the Egyptian people were empowered. They had empowered themselves, but where the state recognized that it was the right of the Egyptian people to figure out, for example, what's the name of that academy out along the Ring Road near the AUC going to be? Is it going to be the Mubarak Police Academy, or will it be some other police academy? Will it be the January 25th Police Academy, a very popular name for about a year? It was January 25th anything, including many fool cards in downtown Tahrir, the January 25th fool card. So the thing is, I think the courts have stepped in to play a role when the political elite really couldn't or wouldn't. And I think especially Tahani al-Gabali made statements initially, some of which were, I actually happen to think rather highly of her. I think she's a very, assertive, outspoken, woman. She can be over the top, but, it's not, she doesn't have a really easy role as the only woman on the Supreme Constitutional Court. And certainly not given the role that she plays, I think, in Egypt. So I actually have quite a bit of sympathy for her. But for example, her statements in May of 2000, which she claimed later were misunderstood, that educated people should get 2 votes while uneducated people should get 1 vote, were not wise. Let's put it that way. They weren't wise. Okay. On the other hand, the venom that Tahani has experienced, I really can only attribute to basically patterns of misogyny. I just don't understand the level of anger at her. I can understand people being angry at her, but the way in which it's expressed, you would think that this woman was really the devil incarnate, and she's not. So that's one thing. The other thing I think is that it's very clear that many Egyptians, and certainly the Muslim Brothers, want the courts to bring in particular kind of verdicts. And it's always been very clear to people in the judicial system that they couldn't. It's a problem. You might want to find, Mubarak may have been guilty of many political crimes. Proving him actually guilty of murder is not something for which the evidence exists. And judges understood this very early on. So this is the other side of the maintenance of the rule of law. It was I'm sorry, I don't mean to go on, and I hope I'm not being boring, but it's just that the reality is that many people understood that there was, again, an intense contradiction here. Because while maintaining the rule of law was very important for Egyptians, and for making this process one that is a lot less violent and a lot less inhumane than many revolutions have been, it was also going to prove to be very disappointing to a lot of people. There is no moment at which Mubarak is going to hang. There is no moment at which somehow the forces of light will come forth and defeat in the court. I mean, that's for television. That's what happens in television movies about courts. Anybody who's been in a court knows that's not what actually goes on there. And the Supreme Constitutional Court, all of the courts have played very, I think, important roles, but often because of the weakness of the political system. And there's certainly a lot of unhappiness, and the real danger going forward is that clearly the Muslim Brothers see the courts at this point, I think, as their major antagonist. And I would not be so naive as to say all the courts were doing was just upholding the law. They have a very clear sense of what they want Egypt to look like too.
Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Hussein Kalut. I'm from Brazil, and I have a question for you. I would like to change the discussion from internal politics for foreign politics. Yesterday, we saw the strikes of a member of Hamas, and that moved the foreign policy of Egypt to a kind of drastic position that they called back for the ambassador in Tel Aviv back to Cairo, and they invited the Israeli ambassador for a conversation. We know, I am a professional diplomat, and we know that in diplomacy, it's a very strong signal. What we could expect from the Egyptian foreign policy if the Israeli government decided to unplate for a larger scale of invasion in Gaza? Thank you.
That's a really, I've been thinking about that, and I would actually love to know what you think, or anybody else. I have no idea. That's all I can say, I guess. I think at this point the Egyptian army does not have, if Israel were to invade Gaza, the reality is the Egyptian army, there is no military option for Egypt. I don't think the Egyptian army has anything that it can actually do. One reason is that the Egyptian army has not been for a very long time operationally in a position to take on the Israeli army. And the second problem, I think, is that, and I think it's something to think about very seriously, I think that there are many Israeli politicians who, as I said, I mentioned earlier in the talk, would like to see Egypt reoccupy Gaza. I think they would prefer Egypt to reoccupy Gaza to themselves reoccupying it. And Israeli incursion into, actually Israeli troops into Gaza would certainly set up that as a possibility. That is, the idea would be that this would put such pressure on Morsi that he could not refrain from sending troops into Gaza. I don't think he'll do that. And so the logic of my looking at this is seeing here Morsi as Stalin, at least in the international arena, which is, from his point of view, the Islamic Revolution has, again, I know a lot of people on the left, liberal left, think the Egyptian Revolution failed. Okay, it hasn't worked, it's terrible. From Morsi's point of view, the Egyptian Revolution won. It seems to be very hard for a lot of people, I think, to get their heads around this. From his point of view, the revolution won. God destroyed, and I met many, many people in Egypt who believe this, God destroyed Mubarak, and that was a miracle. There's no other way to describe what happened between January 25th and February 11th except as a miracle. Okay? And by the way, if social science had a better explanation, I'd be quite happy to know it. So I'm not completely going to discount the miracle explanation. So from his point of view, the revolution won. And from his point of view, the revolution is safe in one place. And if the fact that a bunch of people who, I didn't bring it. I could bring you a list of quotations from Badia and from Morsi about all the time that people wanted us to confront somebody. They wanted us to confront the state in Mohammed Mahmoud. They wanted us to confront the state, oh, by the way, on January 25th. They wanted us to confront the state here and there, and we didn't, because we are prudent and pragmatic. And now that we've won, they want, Nasser didn't win, okay? Sadat didn't win, Mubarak didn't win. Now they want us to go. And what, see our victory destroyed? Why should we do that? So I would be, I can't say for sure, and I know this is going to be interpreted by many people as Morsi is in bed with the Israelis, which may be the practical outcome. But I don't think that's how he sees it. He sees it as the revolution has won. Why should he put it at risk? What does he get out of it? What does Egypt get out of it? So I would say I expect him to do things like withdraw ambassadors, possibly at some point even ask the Israeli ambassador to go home, do many, many things that you do in diplomatic circles, and they're strong. But for most Egyptians, it's kind of like when President Obama gives a really strong message to Benjamin Netanyahu, you really shouldn't do those settlements. Okay, so I mean that's nothing. So I'm very dubious that he will do much. Although it's possible that the Israeli government, if they really want to force the Ikhwan into contradiction, they can do that. And I think that's part of. I also do think that's part of what's going on, is to confront Morsi with evidence both of his weakness and also to force him to overplay his hand. But the Muslim Brothers have been very, very good, much better than their opponents would like, about not overplaying their hand.
I think we're going to have to leave it there. Please join me in thanking Professor Goldberg for his fascinating.
Thank you.